Well, Greg, thank you very much for taking the time. This is it's kind of a new series we've been kicking around, so you get to kick it off for us.
Nice.
And it probably just a 20, 30-minute conversation, real conversational. You know so much about what's going on in our city with companies. And actually what kind of spurred this, there was an article that we kind of circulated talking about Georgia's booming tech and startup scene and Atlanta becoming the next Silicon Valley of the South. And we said, who better to be on a conversation and have a call with to talk about kind of that concept and what you're seeing in the real world today, especially. I really look forward to hearing kind of what you're seeing now versus last year. I know being kind of a slow year, kind of heard your State of the Union from last year at the Metro Chamber, but love just to hear what you're seeing and are people coming back.
Thank you for reaching out, and this is a topic that I really enjoy talking about, so I'm honored to be part of it.
Oh, we appreciate it. So I sent you a few questions, but again, go off on tangents. Brooks, ask questions. I'd love just to kind of be very conversational. But just from a Metro Atlanta Chamber perspective, how do you guys support and promote growth in the region's tech and startup ecosystem?
Sure. So I'd like to address startup companies, but also big technology companies. And I'll give you a little bit of a historical perspective from my point of view. I started working for the Chamber in 2011, kind of coming out of the Great Recession. I'd been working for Invest Atlanta prior to that. And at that time, if you can think back to 2011, we had some technology companies here. But if you think about Tech Square in Midtown, it existed, but nothing like what it is today. I mean, we had a handful of technology companies, and so I can recall at the Chamber, we started a technology leadership council, and people like John Yates from Morris, Manning and Martin were very involved, and at that time, Jeff Sprecher from ICE, and others, and we really wanted to heavily promote and market Atlanta as a technology hub because we have one of the top engineering schools in the country in Georgia Tech in Midtown. Plus, we have tons of other great colleges and universities, Morehouse, Clark, Spelman, Georgia State, Kennesaw State, SCAD, Emory, UGA, and many, many more. So we know that we've got this large concentration of universities. We have a very reasonable cost of doing business. We have a rapidly growing population with people moving here from all over the world. We have an airport where it's just really easy to get anywhere you need to go. And so as Georgia Tech was building out Tech Square, we were spending a lot of time in San Francisco knocking on doors of big tech companies, establishing relationships. And a common question at that time was, what's your impression of Atlanta? And the typical answer we would get was, we've been through Hartsfield Airport for a connecting flight. Isn't Coca-Cola headquartered in Atlanta? That's kind of the typical answer, but no real in-depth knowledge. And so as we spent more and more time and developed relationships, we were fortunate to get West Coast tech companies to spend time, and we would set up their visit for 2 or 3 days. And at the end of the visit, the response was, we had no idea that Atlanta was like this. We're completely blown away. We would set up meetings with the Georgia Tech Computer Science Department. We would talk with some existing technology companies. Back then, I recall Cox Enterprises was a huge supporter and always willing to talk to technology companies to help us promote the area. And then we started to get some traction. Panasonic Automotive Systems of America, which is based in Peachtree City, came to us and they said, we're struggling to get engineers to locate south of Atlanta. What do you think we should do? And Tech Square was not an obvious answer at that time, but we said, well, what if you had an outpost at Tech Square and you could engage Georgia Tech interns and co-op students and Georgia Tech faculty? And so Panasonic was one of the first to open an innovation center at Tech Square. And then once we had one, we had a case study that we could start selling. And then we worked with AT&T. They had innovation centers that they called foundries. And they had one in Palo Alto, they had one in Tel Aviv, they had one in Dallas. And we worked with them to open one at Tech Square in Atlanta. And then Home Depot opened an innovation center, and NCR opened an innovation center. And in total, we kind of grew to 20 or 30 innovation centers. And then as word started to get out, we had bigger requirements. Like Honeywell came to us and they said, we need to open a software development center somewhere. And Atlanta is one of 10 cities that we're thinking about. And we worked with Honeywell and ultimately convinced them to open in Midtown Atlanta, where they've ramped up to about 800 software engineers. And then it just, the story, it took off from there. Of course, Georgia Tech partnered with Portman and built the Coda building, and NCR built their global headquarters. And from there, it just kind of evolved into different technology nodes around the area. I think the development of Avalon and Alpharetta has been great for the tech sector in North Fulton County. Ponce City Market has attracted a lot of technology companies. David Cummings in Atlanta Tech Village in Buckhead, I believe transformed the Buckhead market. And so that was sort of I named a lot of bigger established companies. At the same time, on the startup side, we very much partnered with David Cummings, who's on the board of the Metro Atlanta Chamber. And we created a program called Backed by ATL, where we would solicit startup technology companies to be part of a cohort that we would support, and we would match them with some of the bigger brands in the area as mentors and potential partners or acquirers. And that was a very successful program. We worked very closely with Venture Atlanta, which has become one of the biggest venture capital conferences. We've spent a lot of time in Palo Alto and Menlo Park, driving up and down Sand Hill Road, establishing relationships with venture capital firms. Same thing in Boston and New York. So, and then we worked with entrepreneurs like Alan DeBeery, who you may know created Manhattan Software in Manhattan Beach, California, moved it to Atlanta, sold that, got involved with a Georgia Tech startup called AirWatch that did mobile device management software, scaled up AirWatch, received a venture capital investment from Excel Partners in Palo Alto. I think it was like a $220 million investment. And then ultimately he sold AirWatch to VMware for about $2 billion. So we've got a lot of great stories of Atlanta tech entrepreneurs that have been very successful. As a chamber, we've worked with various partners in Metro Atlanta to help them to be successful. And then at the same time, we've recruited these really big global brands like Google, Microsoft, Cisco, Honeywell, and many others to come to the area. And it's just been remarkable to see the transformation of Atlanta and how successful it's been.
So, Greg, I guess I missed that wave with Alan DeBerry and Manhattan Associates. I lived in Manhattan Beach after college, so I obviously didn't meet him after college. I'm interested. It seemed like in those early years, Georgia Tech was an anchor for kind of that first movement. What were some of the other key attributes that when you started talking and others started to talk to the folks in Palo Alto and get them to come out and start taking a look, what initially grabbed them? And then outside of the talent at Georgia Tech, what are some of the other key attributes that you guys have leaned into, the city of Atlanta has leaned into to continue to get some momentum, the momentum that it seems like the city has now?
Sure. One thing that I have learned in my career in economic development, I started in 1994 in Buffalo, trying to recruit businesses to Buffalo, New York. And then I moved to Boston, Massachusetts, and did that for about 5 years, and then came south. And when I moved into a new market, I came in thinking that I could apply a lot of what I've learned in those other markets into Atlanta and sort of like make Atlanta into one of the Life sciences was great and huge in Boston, and we could create a life sciences corridor in Atlanta because I was part of that in Boston. But what I learned was to be really successful, you have to sort of embrace your unique qualities in your community and accentuate those and use those as your selling points and become what's unique to you. So I say that because, in our thinking, we didn't want to become Silicon Valley. There's always this comparison or, let's become the next Silicon Valley. And so getting back to our selling points or our attributes, I think one thing that was really, unique to Atlanta is the diversity of our workforce. And when you look at the diversity of our population in general, Atlanta currently is the sixth largest metro area in the United States. We're the third fastest growing. We have 6.3 million people. Last year, we gained 69,000 net new residents, and they're coming from all over the world. And that just, builds on the diversity. We're diverse in every way that you can be, from a ethnic standpoint, from an international standpoint, culturally, religiously. We're just wonderfully diverse in Atlanta, and we've embraced that. And so when I go out to California or Seattle or Boston, the number one talking point with companies, especially technology companies, is the ability to recruit diverse talent and have diversity of ideas. And that's a strength for companies. You may know Michael Ford, who is the former head of real estate for Microsoft. He's now with AT&T, but he made the decision to put the campus at Atlantic Yards in Midtown. And he spoke at an Atlanta Commercial Board of Realtors meeting. You guys may have been there a few years ago. And he said 5% of Microsoft's workforce is Black and 6% is Hispanic. Our number one goal is to increase those percentages. And we believe that Atlanta is the best place to do that. And I hear that again and again from technology companies. When I work with Micron is a semiconductor company based in Boise, Idaho. Their number one priority was recruiting diverse talent. Cisco, same thing. For Google, that's a huge priority. So when companies come in, not only do we bring in Georgia Tech and highlight that Georgia Tech awards more engineering degrees to women and minorities than any other college on the planet, we also have Morehouse, and we have Clark, and we have Georgia State University, which has 11,000 Black enrolled students, and it awards more undergraduate degrees to Black students than any other college in the United States. So that diversity that we have in Atlanta has helped with the growth of our tech sector immensely. And now on the entrepreneurial side, we see organizations like the Russell Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, which focuses on supporting Black entrepreneurs. And we have the Gathering Spot. And of course, at Georgia Tech, you have the Advanced Technology Development Center, which works to support entrepreneurs. So I would say that is something that captures the interest and attention of technology companies globally, and it's a huge strength for Atlanta.
Yeah, I found from my conversations with many of the landlords and owners of Class A buildings across Atlanta and the Sun Belt, you probably have had the same conversations, and I know Chris has. That topic, when I asked them when they interview their potential clients to be or their current tenants of their buildings, especially the Fortune 500, and I know we've got 18 of them here in Georgia. The number one thing they say is, I have to have a large presence in Georgia, or I have to plant a flag here for that primary reason. That is a strength to lean into for sure.
Yeah.
You kind of segue, and you mentioned a lot of them, just attracting the tech giants like Google and Honeywell and NCR, Cisco, Microsoft, Apple. Kind of specifically, how does the Metro Atlanta Chamber kind of lean in to those relationships and kind of engage these companies? And really, I guess, is it an incentive conversation, or what's the carrot for you guys on how you work with them?
Yeah, well, it's something that I think that for myself and all my coworkers, we take a lot of pride in the cold calling that we do and the business development, and we do it all over the world. We've established really long-term relationships all over the globe. An example would be when I was hired here in 2011, the first task I was given was plan a 1-week trip to San Francisco to call on tech companies and site consultants. And I had never been to San Francisco before, didn't know a single person there. And I figured, wow, how am I going to do this? How am I going to get meetings? So one thing that I did is I went to, and I'll give a plug to Cornet. I went to the Cornet San Francisco chapter directory, and there were about 300 members of that chapter. And I sent LinkedIn requests to all of them, maybe like 80 or 90 accepted. I sent a direct message to everyone who accepted and said, hey, I'm an economic developer from Atlanta. I'm going to be in San Francisco. I'd love to meet with you. And this guy named Don Davis, who's the head of real estate for Visa in Foster City, responded to me and said, I'd be happy to meet with you. So in 2011, I met with Don. He had no project, but he mentioned that he had a son that lived in Peachtree Corners, and he gets to Atlanta from time to time. And I just sort of developed a relationship with Don, and I would see him at the Cornet Summit every year. I would go out to San Francisco and drive out to Foster City and meet with him. And then eventually they had a project where they were considering Atlanta. Now they're at 1,200 Peachtree in Midtown, and they have about 1,000 employees. And it only took 10 years to close that deal, but
short sales cycle.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's what a great story. You've done such an amazing job covering a bunch of my questions and your answers. I'm trying to find a new one.
Yeah, I've got one because we have a history of being involved with Venture Atlanta, and have seen that's evolved right in the ecosystem from a local conference to a Southeastern conference to now, it's certainly national. What's your perspective on Venture Atlanta and that conference and its role in the evolution of, I guess, the tech ecosystem here?
Sure. I think that Venture Atlanta has been a key part of the growth of our entrepreneurial ecosystem. And, back when it was started, that must have been sometime around 2009, before I became involved with the Metro Atlanta Chamber. But the consistency of that organization and how they've grown each conference year after year, attracting more investors from all over the world. And Brooks, as you said, becoming, really a globally known conference. It has been enormously successful. And I think back, I mentioned that at the Chamber, we created a technology council probably around 2010. And we used to put entrepreneurs on stage. I remember we would have companies like Calendly and Sales Loft, when they had, 1 or 2 employees. And now they've grown to be hugely successful companies, and they're giving back to the ecosystem. So Venture Atlanta is a big part of that. And then, I also have to say David Cummings. I can't say enough about what David has done as someone who started his own company called Pardot, years ago as a student, and then ramping up that company, selling it to Salesforce, taking the proceeds and creating Atlanta Tech Village in Buckhead. Yeah. And now what he's doing in South Downtown by, buying 40 to 50 buildings in South Downtown to create what he says will be the biggest entrepreneurial ecosystem on the planet. And I believe he can do it. And that's amazing.
That is. Yeah. I would love to see that happen in downtown Atlanta.
Yeah.
Hey, this is kind of for both of you, just from a remote work perspective. We're obviously still figuring out what that really is going to mean for us all long term. And I think tech companies are in the middle of it and still trying to figure it out. Love seeing some of the new announcements we're starting to see from UPS, NCR. But when you look at that, how do you see Atlanta's tech ecosystem adapting to these changes, and what opportunities or challenges do you think that presents our city?
Well, I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, it seems like the financial services sector and the corporate headquarters are leading the way. Chris, those announcements that you mentioned, plus, in talking to companies like Fiserv and BlackRock and Morgan Stanley that have a significant and growing presence here, you know, they seem to be requiring people to come back, 3 or 4 days a week, or even 5 in some cases. And that momentum seems to be picking up. Uh, on the technology side, until NCR Voyix announced a couple weeks ago, I hadn't seen that as much. But on the encouraging side, we're seeing companies like Adobe, I think is a really good example. They had 200 or so employees working remotely in Atlanta, and then they took 5,000 square feet at Colony Square in Midtown. And that's sort of like a landing pad where people can go in if they want someplace to go. But I imagine at some point, Adobe's going to hit the point where they say, it would really be nice to have those 200 people all in the office at one time. And we're going to have to go from 5,000 square feet to whatever that might end up being. And I have the feeling that there's a lot of companies in that situation where maybe that time isn't right now at this moment, but in the next year or two, I'm hopeful that that's going to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if Brooks or either one of you saw the Cousins report that came out. I think it was in the last week. Colin Connolly was quoted. I think they're 88% leased in their portfolio, 87, 88% leased. Yeah. But it was really encouraging because they're seeing a lot of expansions in kind of their tenant mix, which we haven't really heard that in a while. So hopefully that's kind of the sign of things to come.
Yeah, and I think Cousins is a good example. Most of their portfolio is really well positioned in Class A, highly amenitized locations in newer buildings, which frankly, there's really not enough of those because that's the flight to quality has been real, and that's been a common theme for most companies as they're trying to attract their talent back to the office. So Cousins is really well positioned, but it's you're seeing that. And there are some buildings that are in a little bit more precarious position because of their location. But as far as, to Chris, to add on to what Greg said and to answer some of your question as far as remote work, I mean, there were the name brand leaders, as far as coming back to work. And when you look at the smaller tech companies and just businesses in general, in the middle market, there were some that chose to say, hey, we are an in-office company. This is who we are at the beginning. And then some said, we're going to wait and see. And through that transition, as we've continued to talk to leaders, one thing's come out from leadership across the board, no matter what the size of the company, the majority of them want their people back in the office, not necessarily 5 days a week. I think the days of 9 to 5 days a week are probably not necessary, but I think we've all realized what are the advantages of coming together and what do we get out of that, and then the certain types of work that you don't have to come into the office for, and maximizing that. So the hybrid work solution is real, but we are accelerating, it seems like, to more people coming back.
All right, I'll wrap up with one more question. We have a few more minutes. I want to be cognizant of the time. But looking ahead, crystal ball, what do you think some of the biggest opportunities and challenges facing Atlanta as we continue to grow and establish ourselves as the tech hub of the South?
Sure. I'm very optimistic about Atlanta's future. We have enjoyed so much population growth, and that's expected to continue. There's no reason to think why it won't continue. I think it could even accelerate. Last year we were the 8th largest metro. We surpassed Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. last year to become the 6th largest metro. And we're the 3rd fastest growing. Only Houston and Dallas are growing faster than Atlanta. And I think that companies follow people because they need to recruit talent. So companies are going where the people are going, and the people are coming to Atlanta. So that will continue. We have all of the appealing fundamentals that companies are looking for. We have a very reasonable cost of doing business. We have a reasonable cost of living. We have great universities like Georgia Tech and Emory and Morehouse and Spelman and University of Georgia. We've got the airport where it's just easy to get anywhere you need to go. We have great real estate options, as Brooks was mentioning. We've got heavily amenitized, really fun, cool, modern buildings, whether you want to be, on the Beltline near Ponce City Market, or you want to be on the west side in one of our new buildings, or even in our suburban areas like Avalon and Alpharetta, or the Battery in Cobb County. We're just a very appealing area, and so that will continue to attract companies.
Love it.
Exciting times ahead of us.
Yeah,
Yes.
really are.
Well, thanks
Well,
for joining us, Greg. We really
Yeah, I
appreciate
really
this.
appreciate it. That was
Yeah.
fantastic. You definitely encouraged me, give me hope in a tough real estate environment.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, well, let's work together to recruit some more companies.
Love
We're all
that.
about it. Yep.
All right,
Well,
guys.
thanks,
Well, thanks
Greg.
for having